Well, this is grotesque and just the latest instalment in a systematic, deliberate, coordinated campaign waged by Israel and its cheerleaders to sow doubt in the official death figures in Gaza. That is, the numbers slaughtered by Israel's genocidal campaign against the Palestinian people. This is known as atrocity denial. Atrocity denial costs lives because it seeks to reduce opposition to a murderous onslaught. It seeks to disguise the nature of such an onslaught and thus enable the slaughter of many more civilians, as well as diminishing accountability so those responsible don't face justice, enabling future atrocities. Now, this is what has happened. Pro-Israeli propagandists spread the claim that the United Nations halved their estimate of the number of women and children killed by the Israeli military in Gaza since the 7th of October. The Jerusalem Post appears to have kickstarted this current wave of disinformation with an article headlined, UN seemingly halves estimate of Gazan women, children killed. They write, on May the 6th, the UN published data showing that 34,735 people had reportedly been killed in Gaza, including over 9,500 women and over 14,500 children. On May the 8th, the UN published data showing 34,844 people had reportedly been killed, including 4,959 women and 7,797 children. We'll come on to these figures, but needless to say, the Jerusalem Post has form when it comes to what could be described as atrocity denial. In December, the Jerusalem Post published an article claiming that dead Palestinian babies were being faked using dolls with their grieving parents, thereby clearly faking their anguish. They were forced to retract that article, but not before it went viral and continues to be propagated by pro-Israel propagandists. But to be fair, the level of disinformation was a lot worse in terms of what came afterwards with the Jerusalem Post, because they slyly put in their headline, seemingly, presumably to protect them from such accusations. So the current disinformation was given real legs by the grandly titled Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a small neoconservative think tank in the United States which propagates pro-Israel talking points and which led the attack on Barack Obama's Iran deal. They published a piece saying the United Nations Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs revised its child fatality figure from the Gaza war sharply downward, referring to the statistics outlined previously. They issued a press release in which one of their senior figures said, this change may signal that the UN has finally recognised the lack of evidence between Hamas's original claims that more than 14,000 children and 9,000 women have been killed in Gaza. If so, the UN should state clearly that it has lost confidence in sources whose credibility it has affirmed for months. Another of their figures said, while the UN's belated decision to rectify the casualty figures is welcome, it may come too late to undo the harm already caused. The delay has bolstered Hamas's position and increased its chances of survival in the conflict. Well, that clearly reveals the game being played there, they think, by making people believe fewer Palestinians are actually being killed than is the truth. That will bolster Israel's military position. Now, the well-known reputable media outlet, Fox News, followed suit with a piece headlined, UN revises Gaza death toll, almost 50% less women and children killed than previously reported. See, it just gets more and more confident as the lie spreads. While the journalist Noga Tarnopolsky, who positions herself as a liberal opponent of Netanyahu, tweeted, proof of how problematic it is that Hamas is the only body issuing numbers of the dead in Gaza. They refer there to the UN agency changing its figures of the estimated dead in Gaza from 34,844 to 24,686, dropping the estimated number of women and children killed from 69% to 52%. Wanton disinformation here. I asked her to retract, and yet her tweet still stands. Just astonishing behaviour. Unsurprisingly, Israeli figures latched onto all of this, with the Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz tweeting, the miraculous resurrection of the dead in Gaza. The UN has reduced its estimate of women and children killed in Gaza by 50% and claims that it relied on data from the Hamas Ministry of Health. Anyone who relies on fake data from a terrorist organisation in order to promote blood libels against Israel is anti-Semitic and supports terrorism. They're just astonishing. Just pointing at anything that they don't find favourable to their war aims as Hamas, anti-Semitic terrorist supporters, which ends up meaning, well, I mean, they had one of their ministers, the Israeli government's ministers the other day said Hamas loves Joe Biden. That's where they're currently at. This minister, the foreign minister, ends by calling on the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres to resign. Now, what actually is the truth here? Well, the brilliant academic and misinformation expert Mark Owen Jones, who is a near namesake who should make Owen Joneses everywhere proud, did a really good thread exposing this total nonsense. He points out the media is focusing on 2 infographics by the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in the Palestinian territories. What's so absurd here is that in these graphs, the number of reported fatalities actually went up from 34,735 on the 6th of May to 34,844 on the 8th of May. But in the latest graph, they add something new, which is these reported fatalities include 24,686 fatalities identified as of 30th of April, offering then a specific breakdown of these identified fatalities, which include just under 7,800 children, approaching 5,000 women, and over 1,900 elderly Palestinians. As he notes, all that's happening is the UN agency, OCHA, has added figures for the dead that have been identified. It quite clearly says that the breakdown does not include 10,000 missing or buried under rubble. Now, what's so absurd about this blatant misinformation is that in the image shared, such as by the journalist Naga Tarmpolowski, it has in small print at the bottom, not including more than 10,000 reported missing or under the rubble. Clearly says that. Now, Mark Owen Jones goes on to say, even in the summary notes on both days, it's quite clear the total fatalities has increased. It's not revised the number downward and has not stated that the 10,000 missing or buried under the rubble have magically changed sex or age, because obviously that's what's being factored in when discussing the breakdown of deaths. Now, he goes on to say the fact is the number of deaths has increased by over 102 days. Sadly, some people are trying to somehow frame this as a decrease and a propaganda win is disturbing. It's as if killing 24,686 people is fine, but 34,000 is not. I mean, just thinking about these numbers, I mean, 1,200 killed on 7th of October in Israel was considered an absolutely intolerable number. Israel's population is much bigger than Gaza's population, so the proportionate numbers we're talking about here are much, much greater. This itself, this macabre game, which is based on misinformation in any case, speaks to just how little Palestinian life is valued. Now let's listen to Farhan Haq, the deputy spokesperson for the UN Secretary General, responding to a question specifically on this point.
Thanks, Farhan. There's some reporting that's come out that says, quote, the UN has halved the number of casualties.
Halved, yes. It's a hard word to say.
Yeah. You know what I'm talking about, though,
yes,
right?
I do know. Cut in half.
Cut in half, thank you. The casualties from Gaza, is that true?
It's not quite the case, no. What I can tell you is this. The overall number of fatalities that's been tallied by the Ministry of Health in Gaza, which is our counterpart on dealing with the death tolls, that number remains unchanged, and it's at more than 35,000 people since October 7th. What's changed is the Ministry of Health in Gaza has updated the breakdown of fatalities for whom full details have been documented. So what they recently published was that they gave figures for 24,686 out of 34,622 overall fatalities recorded in Gaza. And those 24,686 people are the ones for whom full details have been documented. In other words, people who have been fully identified. Out of that smaller number, that subset of identified bodies, you have 7,797 children, 4,959 women, 1,924 elderly, and 10,006 men. And the Ministry of Health says that the documentation process of fully identifying details of the casualties is ongoing. Meanwhile, as you can see if you do the math, that there's about another 10,000 plus bodies who still have to be fully identified. And so then the details of those, which of those are children, which of those are women, that will be reestablished once the full identification process is complete. Our teams in Gaza are unable to independently verify these figures, given the situation on the ground and the continuing combat and the sheer number of fatalities. And so we cite the the Ministry of Health as the source for our figures.
And do you have any reason to believe that the Ministry of Health numbers are incorrect based on the years that the UN has worked with the Ministry of Health of Gaza?
Unfortunately, we have the sad experience of coordinating with the Ministry of Health on casualty figures every few years for large mass casualty incidents in Gaza. And in past times, their figures have proven to be generally accurate.
So what's happened is the Palestinian Ministry of Health has updated its breakdown. Now, clearly a significant number of fatalities are never going to be identified. Let's be clear here. Gaza is an area of territory no bigger than East London. It's one of the most densely populated areas on Earth, and explosives with a combined force of several Hiroshima bombs have been detonated in Gaza over the last few months. Most civilian infrastructure has been severely damaged or destroyed to the extent Gaza looks a different colour and texture from space. What does that mean in practice? Well, for a start, huge numbers of people have been buried under rubble, with their retrieval extremely challenging given the apocalyptic conditions Gaza has been subjected to. But the infernos caused by Israeli missiles also means there are many bodies which are incinerated or at least just not recognisable. After the 9/11 attacks in the United States, 40% of victims were never identified. In 2 cases, remains of those killed in the 2001 attack were only identified a few months ago. That is 22 years after the attack. May well be that other remains will continue to be identified long after the event. We're getting on for a quarter of a century now. And that's not only the conditions which exist in Gaza, with a medical system which has been largely destroyed. Indeed, after the 7th of October attacks in Israel, the Israeli authorities for a period misidentified bodies of fighters, either belonging to Hamas or other armed groups, as Israeli citizens. Again, not under the conditions which exist in Gaza. Now, as the UN noted in that press conference, in all previous Israeli onslaughts against Gaza, the Gaza Ministry of Health statistics have proved accurate. The actual problem here is the opposite to that being claimed: undercounting, from the numbers buried under the rubble to the breakdown of the reporting system, not least given the destruction of Gaza's hospital system, which is crucial to being able to identify and report those who are killed, to the numbers being killed, for example, because of the obliteration of healthcare, thus leaving cancer patients or people with heart problems without treatment, which is why a far more reliable final figure will be excess deaths. That is the number of those killed compared to the deaths you would expect with the pre-existing trend, because that will then take into account everyone from violent deaths to people who have died because of the lack of food and basic essentials of life, to those who are not being treated for their medical conditions. We know from precedent that in catastrophic wars of this scale, most who end up being killed are not killed because of the direct violence, but from the impacts of such a devastating cataclysm on a society. Those peddling atrocity denial are doing so because the truth cannot be hidden from the public. This is one of the great crimes of our age. So all they can do is muddy the waters, sow confusion and doubt, make people think, oh, well, it's all so complicated, so I don't know what to think. Now, it's damning that even their nonsense claims would mean a terrible bloodbath of ordinary people, including so many children. But what they've said is false. The identified fatalities will only be a proportion of the overall actual fatality number at this point, and a significant number of those killed are never, ever going to be identified. Whether that be those incinerated beyond recognition, left to decompose, buried in unmarked graves, flattened by Israeli tanks, eaten by the starving cats and dogs of Gaza. Not pleasant to hear, I know, but it's the truth. And we cannot let these shameless, morally depraved propagandists bury the truth like the Israeli state has buried so many Palestinians. Please like and subscribe. Do leave your comments. Do share. Do help us take on the pro-war media and rebut these lies at patreon.com/OJS84. Listen to us the podcast. I'll speak to you soon.